Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Pan Future Society podcast. Today is Saturday, June 17th, 2017. We continue our series on energy and power this week with an interview with Oregon State University PhD candidate Josh Fishler. Josh was kind enough to sit down with me for a fairly long and wide-ranging interview about nuclear energy, both some specifics about his own work and work done at OSU, and in general about nuclear energy and the public's perception of nuclear energy and the role that it should play in our near future production of energy. In addition to the pluses and minuses of nuclear power that we talked about, including how we're trying to deal with the downsides that there are, we also discussed at length the notion of perspective and context that any given complex situation has, and that humans seem to be bad at understanding. And we also speculated about some futuristic power generation, including what research is actually going on with fusion. This was, like I said, a fairly long interview, like some of my interview episodes tend to be, so I'm going to forego the news for this week and get right to it. Also, up front, I also need to offer a disclaimer that the views expressed by Josh are his own and not necessarily reflective of the university or meant to be taken as any official Oregon State University policy, blah, blah, blah. Totally fine by me. That was a small request from the university department when I was looking for an interview subject. And that's kind of normal boilerplate stuff. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. I'm here with Josh Fishler, a PhD candidate at Oregon State University, and we are going to talk about nuclear power. Ooh.
Oh, come on, this is exciting. This is yes. Science fiction in reality.
Yeah. So give me a little introduction about what you do here and what you're working toward.
So I'm an experimental thermal hydrolysis. So basically what that means is I design and execute my own experiments around thermal hydraulics. So that's looking at heat and mass transport for fluids. And in particular, my research is on gas reactors. And they're an advanced reactor concept, and they are supposed to not only provide electricity by, boiling water, turning a turbine in a generator, blah, 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 normal stuff, but they're also supposed to provide process heat. And that's kind of important because that process heat has industrial applications in, metallurgy, chemical processing. Like, those are big industries that need that kind of heat. And currently you have to burn some sort of fossil fuel to get it. So if you can take, the coke that you're burning in your boiler and instead just hook up a pipeline and get 800 degrees Celsius helium for all your heating needs, that's great. That's a lot of coal that you don't have to burn.
So is that heat normally just a waste product in a standard reactor?
No. So in a standard reactor, so I'm going to talk about light water reactors. So in a standard reactor, that heat goes towards making steam, essentially. That's really all a nuclear reactor is. It's a very fancy boiler.
That has sometimes, it kind of hurts my brain a little bit to think that most of our electrical production is boiling water.
It's remarkable, right?
Yeah.
Like when you take that high view,
yeah.
It suddenly becomes so much simpler and easier to contextualize. All we need is boil water, turn turbine, make electricity. But there's some quirks to it that make it kind of challenging and also kind of fascinating for me.
Yeah, great. So one of my main reasons for having this interview today was to wade into the debate over nuclear energy. So maybe we should tackle that first.
Yeah, let's get it head on.
people's conceptions of nuclear energy is often a negative one. They think it's dangerous, too dangerous to use. It's makes a mess out of the environment. But that's not necessarily the case. And I think if you, at least through the numbers I've looked at, running the entire world's power needs off of solar and wind isn't going to happen for a long time. We need something to generate electricity when the sun's not shining, when the wind's not blowing, and nuclear really is a valid option for that. So if people's picture of a nuclear reactor is a Chernobyl-type reactor or even The Simpsons, take that apart for me a little bit.
Sure. So that prompt is very complicated. And I'm going to start here by prefacing that we as engineers are generally pretty terrible at recognizing some of the fears that people have. I mean, the technology isn't, scary, but people do have concerns about it, and they're valid. However, what I don't think gets communicated all that well or all that effectively is that we as engineers, we know that. We know just how dangerous this stuff is, and we will take steps. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires that we take extensive steps to make sure that it is safe for the public. So I kind of want to put that up front because the NRC is, they're there to protect, to make sure that we are always protecting the public. But to speak to the point of why nuclear gets a bad rap sometimes is that, well, again, that in and of itself is complicated, but it's basically boils down to a couple of things. One, the visibility that nuclear gets is typically only when it's reporting an accident. And typically the people who are reporting the accident tend to sensationalize it because it's very easy to do that.
It's like a plane crash.
Exactly. However, they don't provide context, and I understand why. It is very hard to spout numbers about, dose rates that, or the public might be getting or that you're getting at the site boundary, but they're important numbers because it sort of highlights what the response is and how severe the accident really is. So you mentioned 3 Mile Island, and that's a great place to start. The most severe consequence of 3 Mile Island is that if you were standing at the gate, at the site boundary, you might have gotten the equivalent of 1, maybe 2 chest x-rays.
And that chest x-ray metaphor is a valuable one for people to understand. I believe flying cross-country is the equivalent of several chest x-rays?
Yeah, I think you've got to spend
1 or 2?
I think you've got to spend somewhere near 60 to 80 hours in the air. But surprisingly, you know what your greatest radiation health risk is?
Is it radon? No.
Well, part of it, it's actually from smoking.
Really?
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure what the causal mechanism is, but I mean, even if you're flying, if it's part of your job, if you compare someone who's in great health, doesn't smoke, but is flying all the time versus someone who, is a routine smoker, the difference in their annual dose rate is, an order of magnitude. It's a factor of 10 minimum. It's remarkable, where that comes up.
Yeah. Huh. Okay.
But that's how the accidents get reported.
Yeah.
But I think there's a larger narrative there because unless you grew up in a pro-nuclear household like I did, like my dad, he was a nuclear engineer down at Entergy in Mississippi. So I got exposed to this technology and I learned how it worked, at least in a broad sense, fairly early on. But if you don't have that, then you're just sort of guessing at how it works, and there's no news outlet in the world that is going to talk about decay heat and why that's important. At best, you get Bill Nye's treatment on Bill Nye Saves the World, and even that is horrendously flawed. It's very reductionist, and it's I know it's not an unpopular response to say it's complicated, but the truth is, it is.
Yeah.
And it requires very careful treatment, or else it can become very sensational and very fear-based.
Do you run into any conflation of the idea of nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons?
All
Because
the
they're both
time.
nuclear, then they must be like the same thing. And
So like I said before, I'm an operator. I'm a licensed reactor operator for the Trigga reactor that we have here on campus, and we host tours all the time from various people, from middle school students to Boy Scouts getting merit badges to visiting faculty. And there's a pretty common theme in the questions that I get regarding the conflation of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And even if you talk with anyone from the Tri-Cities in Washington, they conflate power and weapons. But it's important to decouple them because in the case of power, we're not trying to make anything explode. We're trying to turn a turbine. That's what we're there to do. And decoupling that from the weapons legacy, I think, is particularly important, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, because the mindset is different. I mean, our fundamental approach to how we implemented nuclear for those different purposes is fundamentally different. And in the case of, I mentioned the Tri-Cities, so let's go ahead and call it by name. Hanford was constructed and operated in a time where we were in a Cold War with Russia. And it's important to keep that in mind because it informed a lot of the administrative decisions regarding long-term disposal of material. So this is what led to, single-wall subterranean storage pits. It wasn't an environmentally conscious decision. It was a decision motivated by, we have to beat the Russians, and we will do everything it takes to do it. Whereas in the power side of things, we're not concerned with, beating our competitor down the road. We're concerned primarily with making sure the public is safe and that a plant is profitable.
Okay. Well, there you go. Nuclear power's fine.
Yeah, power does not equal bombs. I think as far as insight go, that's...
And I guess it's worth mentioning in case people don't know, the kinds of radioactive material that you use in a power plant are nothing like what you use in a bomb.
Oh my goodness, yes. So I just got back from the annual meeting of the American Nuclear Society, and one of the panels I was fortunate enough to sit in on sort of discussed why they're different and when it intersects with public policy and governments. But the takeaway is that in a bomb or any sort of weapons applications, you're pretty much concerned about plutonium. Fair enough. But the reason is that if you try to burn plutonium in a reactor by itself, not bred in like it naturally will, but if your primary fissile material is plutonium, you build up some really nasty long-lived actinides. Now, aside from making your life as an operator more difficult, that means that your long-term storage plant has to account for it. So it's easier to just stick to uranium. Some plutonium will naturally breed into it. That's fine. In low enough amounts, it's manageable. But the plutonium that you see in weapons is not the same thing that you see in a reactor. And it's an important distinction.
All right. Let's move, I guess the next step from there might be the environmental impact or the concern for the environmental impact that people have of the use of radioactive material or the storage of waste. Do we take good care of it now? Are there any things being researched now that would make it better than the way we do it? Or I guess in my mind I'm picturing drums of glowing material buried in a mountain or something like that, and is that I'm sure somewhat an inaccurate picture.
Well, we're not just leaving it in drums. But let's talk about that, because you sort of touched on a very rich issue, and it's a very challenging one facing nuclear regarding our place in environmental policy and how we can interact with that. And then you sort of touched on long-term disposal. So I'm going to treat them separately.
Okay.
But I want to focus first on the environmental aspect, because this is something I wasn't aware of before going to that conference, but is absolutely fascinating. It's a complex issue, and it does have to deal with market structures within states and regions. So I'm not going to get into regulated and deregulated energy markets, but if you're serious about finding out how you actually pay for electricity, that is exactly the place to start. But we're going to set that aside for now. And instead, I want to introduce a concept called baseload power. So when you look so let's start here. Electricity doesn't get wasted. We don't generate electricity and then, kick it off somewhere or push it into the ground. That's not how it works. We, as operators, we follow a demand curve. Now, that curve, like you'd expect, it changes over time because turn the lights on at various times. A lot of it goes towards, spatial heating or cooling, and those follow, periods of the day that correspond to temperature. It changes with time.
Yeah.
But there is an average mean power that you have to hit, and that's called your base load. Now, the problem with renewable resources is that they're not base load. They just aren't. They're intermittent sources, like you said. Sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow. But where they do fit in is those peaks, when demand increases and there's a confluence of demand and supply from the environment. That's where they fit in. But base load can only be met by steady operation, and currently there are only a few ways to do that. One is, like we've seen, coal-fired plant, natural gas, nuclear, or some other fossil. So you have four options, according to this analogy, and only one of them is non-carbon emitting. Interestingly enough, all four do have radiological concerns. It's not well known, but if you burn natural gas, you're still releasing a significant amount of radioactive material. Same thing with coal.
I can picture the coal. I mean, anything that comes out of the ground may have some, but so does the natural gas.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
Do you know how much offhand? How does it?
I'm struggling to come up with.
Maybe how much doesn't really matter, but is this something? How much of that gets out into the atmosphere compared to a?
Oh, more than you'd think. And this sort of goes into regulation, the regulatory sphere. But obviously, natural gas just naturally has some amount of radiological material in it. Now, on the nuclear side of things, we have very stringent requirements on monitoring and release. Even for a research reactor like we have on campus, we can't release just an immense amount of cesium and iodine.
Yeah.
We'll get shut down.
Yeah.
But on the natural gas side of things, at the well, there is absolutely no requirement for monitoring how much methane gets released, how much radiological material gets released. There's absolutely no requirement there. So it's interesting to see that dynamic of highly regulated, but we still accept it because we acknowledge that our technology is potentially hazardous, versus natural gas, which has largely escaped that level of regulatory requirement.
Yeah, that's kind of disturbing.
It is. But here's something. But I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned that, but renewables play a very interesting role in the market as intermittent sources. And this is one of the myths that I really hope to dispel, that I'm really working hard to dispel, is that because they're intermittent, it's not a one-to-one substitution. You can't just shut down a plant and then build a wind farm out in Iowa somewhere. It doesn't work like that. Primarily, and this is a complicated topic, but it goes into our local and national infrastructure. How we feed into the grid is important, and the grids don't all connect. They're getting better as, obviously urbanization is a phenomenon that's going to continue growing, but those grids from San Francisco to Corvallis don't communicate. So you really, even now, you have to build your power sources where the consumption is, or where the demand is. So in that particular case, how you regulate, how you govern, and more importantly, how you make money is tied to your local region. Now, in places where renewables have seen significant investment, California, I think, oh goodness gracious, a number of other test cases, one of which was Ohio. But these states are heavily investing in renewables. But they're also allowing for out-of-market payments. So that's a tricky phrase that market people love to use. But basically what it means is we as government want to encourage renewables. Therefore, we will subsidize you as producer of renewable energy by giving you money for however much you pay back into the market. However, because you have that subsidy, you can afford to operate at a much lower profit margin than, say, a nuclear reactor can. Now, that's driven by a number of factors, not least of which is the scale. It takes far fewer people to operate, say, a wind farm than it does a nuclear reactor. So your overhead there is significantly higher. But it fundamentally highlights that market reform is going to have to be a part of our national discussion, or at least a statewide or regional discussion, if we want to level the playing field. Because such as it is right now, I can make money selling renewable energy much more effectively than I can selling nuclear energy. And here's what frustrates me the most. Because you still need baseload, if you're shutting down your nuclear plants, that baseload still gets taken up by fossil fuels. So if you're investing heavily in renewable energy and just assuming the market's going to take care of the rest, you're not decreasing carbon emissions. You're actually providing a broken market where they can increase. And I think that's an important distinction to highlight, because where no one's making the case that renewables aren't good. They are going to be the future of how we manufacture and consume our energy. But currently, they have to work with another non-carbon emitting technology, and that's nuclear.
I think my previous show, I started a series about energy, and I want to say that the number nationally was something like 5%, 8%, a very small amount of renewables that are actually in. It's growing, and it's getting cheaper, and it's growing quickly, but it's still a very small number compared to the total power that we use. And at least right now, I mean, no matter how many solar farms and wind farms you build without a significant breakthrough in storage technology, you can't get that base load.
Thank you so much for talking about. So, everyone in the renewables community, not everyone, I'm generalizing, but a significant theme that I've noticed in the renewable sphere is that everyone points to the future technology. Storage will come along, storage will solve our problems. But I fundamentally have a problem accepting that, because one, it means that we have to continue investing in a growing technology in the form of renewables, but then we're also pinning our hopes on something down the line fixing all of our problems. Like, I don't know if you've experienced any sort of mental health crisis, but as someone who has, pinning your hopes on a future solution solving all of your problems never works. It's never worked for me personally, and I don't think it's going to work for our energy market.
Yeah, there's just no way to know. I mean, I've done stories on battery technology, and there is some fascinating, amazing stuff out there in somebody's university research lab. To get from there to scale up is a bigger step than people realize.
Oh, it is, especially when you start talking about those different economies of scale. I mean, it's important to take note of who's really pushing here, and this is where I'm going to point to Elon Musk. It seems like you can't have a conversation in technology without mentioning his name. Anyway, so Elon Musk just put up $10 billion in federally subsidized money. It's not exclusively in federal subsidies, but anyway, regardless. So he puts up $10 billion to build this facility where they're going to be producing the Tesla battery. And everyone says, oh, this is the next step in storage technology. But they don't look any further and realize that the crux of that technology is a lithium-ion battery. If we're going to pin our hopes on storage, we're not dealing with new technology right now. The biggest funder, the biggest mover and shaker, is working with the same technology that is powering your phone. It's important to realize that because everyone's pointing to the future, but no one ever mentions like scale or time. It's not going to be 5 years. It's probably not even going to be 10. More likely, storage technology isn't going to be able to adequately store that thermal energy or that electrical energy, depending on which methodology you pick. That's not going to come around anytime soon. So it's important not to put the impetus on the future to act. It's important to act now. And there's this very convenient dismissal when you talk about renewables that the future will solve it. And that's just unacceptable. I've been fed that line for everything that I care about. And whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's racial equality, whether it's the pay gap, everyone points to the future will solve it. But you can't do that.
No, that's, I can tell you I'm 41, and my experience has shown me it's gotten better. Everything has gotten better, but in very, very small steps.
Yeah.
And it's an extremely long process. So I guess that's, to sum up sort of the argument, I guess, that we're making here is that nuclear is available now.
Yes. Yes. And it is the best storage technology that has ever come around because there's an immense amount of energy stored in our fuel rods. And we only use approximately 5% in current fuel management schemes. Like, there's tons of energy just still sitting there. But, it takes a little bit more technology, a little bit more infrastructure, and a little bit more investment to get it out.
So let's talk about, sort of circle back around to the safety a little bit.
Sure.
We referenced 3 Mile Island before. Or we could talk about Chernobyl. Seems to have been a very severe case.
It's definitely formative.
Can that still happen now? Or is there, if we were to start building nuclear plants again, I'm assuming that we would have something much better. Is there such a thing as a reactor that can't melt down?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm hesitant to come out with a blanket yes statement because even Chernobyl, so I've studied it pretty extensively, as you do when you're studying my field. But it's important to note that Chernobyl shouldn't have happened even at Chernobyl. Like, were several steps that the operators had to take to construct the conditions for that to happen. Plus a few, I'm loath to call them technological quirks because that sort of undermines their importance and the damage they caused. But there were a few characteristics that came with that plant that led to it, but it required safety bypasses, certain scram alarms to be disabled. So it involved a significant degree of human interaction and human decision-making for Chernobyl to happen. So before I say blanket, no, it can never happen again, it's important to realize humans are really good at finding ways around these built-in safety systems. That's an entire field of research that I got to sit in on, is human factors and engineering. How do you make sure that your operators don't do that?
This is we'll go off on a tangent for a moment, but are you saying artificial intelligence systems and stuff being implemented or anything like, self-driving cars will eventually be much safer than we are because they're not us? Or the computer system's just getting more and more advanced to stop you from doing something that's
a great question. The research is there. There is definitely a lot of interest. I think neural networks, machine learning, I see papers regularly on those topics. So I think it's fertile ground. But the problem that you run into is when you try to implement that is you run into the NRC. There are very strict requirements regarding proving new technology before it can be implemented in plants. So neural networks not only have to undergo that regulatory scrutiny, but then they have to find a pilot plan to implement it and then prove that it works.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say no, but it is going to require a pretty significant regulatory effort to let it in. But I think there's a place for it because that's that's the new frontier, is how do we remove the human factor in our most critical systems, and is it something that we wish to do?
Yeah.
That's a very valuable question, because on the other side of it is there is judgment that you as an operator express, and it's hard to make the case that even the best system can replace that judgment.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned before about Chernobyl safety. Can it happen again?
Yeah.
It's getting harder and harder for it to happen. I'll say that. My own research in gas reactors. Now, that's not to say that they're completely safe, but the operating principle behind them is that when you remove the energy density, when you decrease the energy density, the number of quick-lived accidents, which are typically your most destructive, the number that can occur go down. Primarily because, like I said, in gas reactor applications, you don't use water for your moderator and coolant. Rather, you have this large block, this prismatic block of graphite to provide your moderator, and then your helium. Helium is your coolant. When you have that big block of graphite, it is this gigantic thermal reservoir that can take a lot of punishment before anything happens to it. That is assuming, of course, that you don't introduce oxygen into the system, because hot graphite in the presence of oxygen burns. We found that one out in the UK. But assuming that you don't introduce oxygen to the system, it does give you a lot of time as an operator to identify the accident, isolate its propagation paths, and then take corrective action. So in the case of 3 Mile Island, that occurred over the span of hours. If you were to take a similar accident and put it in a high temperature gas reactor application, it might occur over hundreds of hours.
Or in the case of like the Fukushima accident, which was not immediately a threat, but only because they couldn't get to it, I guess. A different kind of cooling system. They had a failure of cooling system. Their backup system didn't work. Is that right?
So to state the obvious, Fukushima was intensely studied and still is amongst our field. But so they had this old BWR, or boiling water reactor design, called the Mark I, and it features this toroidal pool around the reactor, and it is essentially your heat sink. You're relying on that phase change from water to steam to hold all of your thermal energy. Now, this isn't the long-term solution. That's your heat sinks until such time as you can get your backup motors going, or your backup coolant pumps going, so you can provide that active cooling. So the problem with Fukushima was that they lost all of their diesel generators, and therefore their primary cooling capacity. But also they didn't vent as soon as they boiled off most of their pool. So what that means is they didn't relieve the system pressure, which is what led to the explosion that we saw. So it's, again, a combination of human factors, because it is the operators who are responsible for making that call. That being said, you can very clearly see the case, especially when you look at their procedures, that they were following procedure. It takes a lot of courage to implement that kind of judgment against your procedure. So I'm not going to vilify the operators.
No, I did see a program about that disaster, and the things that they did while it was ongoing to try to lessen it or avoid it. I mean, the people going in for the maximum amount of time they could possibly go in and come out, it's a very courageous thing to do in that situation. But it's sort of, I keep wanting to bring up the plane crash analogy, because we've talked about these three disasters, and it was 3 Mile Island in 82, 83? I don't remember the year of that.
Before my time.
But anyway, during my lifetime, there have been 3 nuclear disasters. And so it's like a plane crash. It doesn't happen very often. It gets a lot of attention.
Oh.
But far more people die in car crashes. And one thing I mentioned last week on my show is I want people to keep in mind, you think of a nuclear accident as a threat to health, but how many people have died of lung cancer or asthma attacks caused by pollution from fossil fuels? Far more, much like airplanes versus cars. It's a matter of perspective and the human brain's sort of tendency to only to remember very well the very large things and not notice the day-to-day stuff as much.
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, we as humans are terrible at evaluating risk. We see a number of, we perceive threats, but we don't put them in context, and that's an important exercise to do, because you're right. You're never, and I'm sorry to your listeners who suffer from anxiety because I'm about to make their day a little bit more interesting. We're never really safe. I mean, there is
no, that's true.
The illusion of safety is just that. It's an illusion. We experience this world of risk, and we tend to hide behind safety because it means that we don't have to evaluate various levels of risk. But, and again, this is where I'm going to point to the NRC and just, congratulate them on doing a great job. There are federal models that force us to evaluate risk as the government sees it.
Yeah.
And that's important because, again, this sort of goes back to, we as scientists, engineers, designers, we take this seriously. And we recognize there is risk involved. But we have very prescribed methods for evaluating it, and it can't go above a certain threshold. But you're right. In the life of the average person, like the amount of times that you're going to evaluate, what's putting me most at risk, you don't put that in the scale that you see on, a societal level.
Yeah. So stepping down the chain a bit into the environmental effects, we've discussed nuclear power, whether you like to admit it or not, is not a fossil fuel.
It's non-carbon emitting.
But there is waste associated with it.
Yes.
So what do we do with it? And are we doing the right things with it? Are we figuring out better ways to deal with that, or do the new reactor designs have less waste?
It involves a lot of depends. Now I'm gonna talk first about the reality of spent nuclear fuel, but I'm also then going to put it into context, and then I'm going to give you an idea of methods of how we're dealing with it currently and who wants to do something differently, because that's a debate that's currently going on in the technical community. But let's talk about waste, because it's important to recognize that when nuclear fuel comes out of a reactor, it is highly radiotoxic. Chemically, radioactively speaking, it's nasty stuff. But that being said, we don't just chuck it out on the back 40. So once it comes out of the reactor, it goes into a spent fuel pool where it has to spend some time to let the most highly damaging, the most radioactive elements decay out. And it also gives it a chance to release some of that decay heat. Once it's at an acceptably low level of radioactivity, then it goes into dry cask storage, for most plants anyway. And what that means is it goes into this composite cask of concrete, steel, and other various materials that is robust on a level that I've not encountered anywhere else. There are very strict requirements on what these casks have to be able to withstand, and one of them is a high impact test. I think you pick it up 6 feet and you drop it on a steel spike, on a spike of rebar, and it has to pass. Like there can't be any cracks in the concrete.
Okay.
There are great videos online. I use them all the time when I have to teach classes that touch on this, about them being subjected to impact tests from trains, being submerged in jet fuel for a certain period of time. These things are robust. and they're also very heavy. There was I can't remember at what site, but in the South there was a picture that someone showed me of a tornado that touched down nearby a plant. And of course, the plant was fine. But the picture was of their spent fuel site. And remember, tornado nearby, it moved an inch. One of them moved an inch. I saw that picture and it's like you could see. I wish I'd had a mirror to look at my own face. But as soon as that dawned on me, the amount of momentum it takes to move these things, it's remarkable. But so that's what you do once you take it out of the pool.
So those casks they're very durable. They're also completely shielded. I mean, you could stand right next to them.
Oh yes. No problem. If you ever go up to Columbia Generating Station, assuming that you pass their security screening, they will actually take you out onto the spent fuel pad, and the dry cask storage pad, and they let you touch them. It's absolutely fine. You'll notice that some of them are warm, and that's from the decay heat. But one of the requirements, in addition to durability, is that you have to assume a really high level of radioactivity is present. And if a person is standing right outside, or right adjacent to the cask, that they don't receive an appreciable amount of dose. That's built into the calculation. But, so I mentioned storage pad, and that sort of speaks on our method of dealing with fuel. There is a federal policy regarding long-term disposition, and it's geological disposition. So this is Yucca Mountain. However, as we've noticed, states and various other political factions can severely hamper the implementation of that federal policy. So what currently people do, utilities and reactors, what they'll do is they'll keep it on site. That's going to be a problem, but it's not going to be a problem, depending on who you believe, for about 100 years.
I had a question in mind that was related to that. This matter of perspective, airplanes versus cars.
Oh yeah.
That spent fuel, how much is there compared to people don't think about how much garbage they throw in the garbage can every day.
Right. Great question. So in that same presentation where I got to see, I think the cask moved an inch, they showed the amount of volume of waste that comes out of a coal-fired plant, and it was an ash pond.
Yeah.
And then they did a back-of-the-envelope calculation for the volume of spent fuel that currently exists in the United States, and they occupy approximately the same volume. So the amount of volume of nuclear waste, if you put it out on a football field, it might reach the goalposts. However, an ash pond definitely will, and as
an ash pond from one coal-fired plant.
Exactly. And again, that's just over the life of that coal-fired plant, not over the entire operational history of the nuclear industry.
Yeah.
So you're right. It is a concern, but for the people who think that you can't operate nuclear without having that policy in place, that's not the limiting factor. Not at all. The limiting factor really tends to be whether or not you can make money selling nuclear power. And like I said, with these out-of-market payments and subsidies towards renewables, but not towards baseload providing, it's getting harder and harder. And as we're seeing across the country, we're losing power plants. Now that's concurrent with efforts, especially in Georgia, to build AP1000 plants. We're trying to build new, but it takes a lot more effort to build new than it does to shut something down.
Yeah. Well, that whole economics thing, somewhere down the road, I'll get into that too, because I don't think the system we have is sustainable as it is.
I met some contacts from, I think one of them was from Duke Energy, the other was from the Nuclear Energy Institute, and we got into this great conversation about how you actually sell energy. Oh my God, it's fascinating. It's very complicated because it involves these regional utility boards interacting with one another, and spoiler alert, they don't get along all that well.
So the dry casks and the spent fuel, you said we're pretty much okay for 100 years before we need to figure out somewhere else to put it.
Yeah, and hopefully, some people look at that 100 years as a ticking clock. it's really an opportunity. Because the reason we operate in the once-through system that we do now, which is basically we just put fuel in a reactor and then take it out as soon as it's done, and it goes off to dry cask storage. The reason we do it is because we have a lot of uranium. It's relatively abundant, relatively cheap, and unlike, other fuels or fuel sources, it's not very volatile. But like I said before, we only use about 5% of the energy stored in it. So there are members of the scientific community who think that we ought to adopt a system like France, where we do reprocessing. That is, we go in and try to isolate the fissile isotopes, the fertile isotopes, and then put them back into new fuel. This would be like your MOX plants that you find in the UK. I believe it's called the Phoenix plant in France. I'm not, but asterisk, need to fact check that. Yeah. But these plants, they take spent fuel. They obviously go through a process. Well, not all of them use pyroprocessing, but it's the premier technology for reclaiming some of this. You can use aqueous, but it just requires so much piping. Regardless, I'm getting off on a tangent. So there are processes by which you can get that remaining 95% or some fraction of it out and put it into new fuel. But it requires not only a pretty sophisticated chemical process, but it also involves you implementing advanced reactor technologies. So a great example is sodium fast reactors. And these are reactors that use liquid sodium as a coolant. And the cool thing about them, aside from that alone, is that they operate in a different neutron spectrum than light water reactors. We can get into the physics of that if you're interested. However, the takeaway is that fast spectrum takes all those long-lived, very radiotoxic isotopes that I mentioned previously and fissions them down to something that is much less radiotoxic and long-lived. It takes those half-lives that are on the order of anywhere from 1,000 to 1,000,000 years and takes them down to about 100 years. That's pretty remarkable. It also takes them away from californium, americium, these really nasty elements, and turns them into, say, krypton or barium or whatever the fission spectrum for that particular reaction spits out. And those are manageable. Californium, americium, you really do need to keep an eye on how those leach into the water tables, and that's why I'm getting off topic. But you need to keep an eye on them because they're bad actors. They're bone seekers, and they do cause problems in biological systems.
So those reactors, when you reuse that material, that's, in a nutshell, that's a more efficient system. Like the development of solar panels, you get a certain percentage of energy converted into electrons or into electricity, and people keep researching and developing, so you get more and more efficient solar panels. You can do the same with your nuclear fuel.
Ooh, yes. Sorry. I'm from the South, in case that wasn't obvious from that. But yeah, the new generation of reactors is looking for a level of efficiency that is frankly remarkable, especially for me as someone who's, trained in thermal hydraulics and thermal sciences and thermodynamics. They're looking at system efficiencies on the order of about 40%. And in the case of some of the supercritical CO2 prospective designs, that might even get higher. That is almost Carnot levels of efficiency. That is amazing. And you achieve that through high temperatures, high pressures, so it comes with its own challenges. But the new generation is taking the 33 some odd percent efficiency that we're currently operating with in commercial light water reactors and bumping it up closer to about 37, 38, 39, or even 40 in the case of TerraPower's reactor. Yeah. So you get more electricity out of less material. Yes. Your material at the end of the process is less hazardous. Yes. Or less of the hazardous stuff. And I would imagine that you can also build smaller systems to, again, back to picturing 3 Mile Island or The Simpsons, the giant
towers and everything, that's no longer even necessary, really. And I'm wondering, this kind of dovetails into a question I was going to ask about grids and the efficiency of our grid, and wondering if the future of power is more localized. The giant power plant on the edge of town that tries to feed 200,000 people, that's not really the best way to do it. We will have sort of, your neighborhood will have its own small reactor.
That is a fascinating topic. I had the great fortune to talk to one of the leaders of our industry, Dr. William Magwood, and I asked him in particular, what has to happen? What is really the future of nuclear? Are we going to... I said nuclear. It really is sort of the future of our grid and our infrastructure. Is it going to fracture even further? Are we going to see energy independent pockets of the United States that that run their own grid? They might export towards the next town over to make a little more money, but is it going to be that, or are we going to see a nationally integrated grid? And that's a question no one has an answer for yet. I think a lot of people have an idea, but my mentor, Dr. Andy Klein, who's currently the ANS president, or I should say the new president, just was elected in, he highlighted infrastructure is one of the grand challenges facing our industry. Because if we continue to build big plants, the places where we can put big plants is limited. And it's also limited in growth rate because it has to follow these large population shifts.
And that challenge applies to no matter how you're producing your electricity,
Exactly.
whether it's nuclear or building a 50-acre solar farm out in the desert. Sounds like a great idea, but you still got to get that electricity to where it's being used.
Oh my God, and that is so. Infrastructure investment, like I said, it's one of those grand challenges, but it's sort of like, it's not a technically complicated issue. Where it comes in is transmission, because like you said, you have to get it somewhere, and how you get the land is important, because the government currently invokes eminent domain. Now, I don't care if you do offer fair market price to someone. When you take their land, they're angry. So there have been people who have tried to license studies for siting studies of putting plants somewhere. This isn't even, there's no ground being broken, nothing's going up or in or anything at all. We're just looking, and there are enough there's enough rural opposition just because they've been burned by eminent domain that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So I think if you want to go like a nationally integrated route, I mean, you do have to not only secure the financial resources necessary to do that, but you also have to consider how we're going to make that happen, because we as nuclear, we have this conception that we can just rely on government. We can rely on those mechanisms to just sort of take over for us and not engage the community. But I think it's been very clearly highlighted that we are going to have to consider that capacity building. We are going to have to engage the rural community. We're going to have to meet them halfway. And I think that we're only just now seeing that be supported in not only the technical leaders, but also their representatives in Washington and elsewhere.
Yeah. So setting regulatory and public perception hurdles aside, how small of a reactor can you build that's practical?
That depends on what you want to use it for. So, are you talking about...
Let's just say electrical generation, if... could I put a reactor in the space that would fit a hot tub and power my neighborhood? Or... I'm a little on the science fiction side of things here. We're stretching into speculative territory, I
Actually,
guess.
I'm gonna follow along. I'm gonna chase you down that rabbit hole. So, It is possible. Well, before I answer that question, let me give you some scale. So the trigger reactor that we have on campus is rated to produce 1 megawatt. Well, we're actually, licensed to produce 1.1 megawatts, but that's neither here nor there. So we produce 1 megawatt of thermal power. And the core that we use to do that is no bigger, well, it's a little bit bigger than a trash can. So it's about maybe 2 feet in diameter, all 92 of our fuel elements, and it might be 3 feet, maybe. The active fuel region is 15 inches high. So, with you got your reflectors on either side, that might come out to, I think it's like 17 some odd inches. So it's possible to produce quite a substantial amount of electricity with a very small reactor. The problem you run into, and the reason why you can't just build one of these in your backyard, is that there's shielding that you have to account for. So because this is, again, you're worried about dose rates to the public, you have to build a lot of shielding in place. Now, the way we do that on campus is several feet of concrete surround the reactor, and it's also underneath about 20 feet of water. So that means that you get a dose rate on top of the reactor of approximately 90 MR per second. 90 MR per hour. Per hour is important. 90 millirem per hour. And that is just under a high radiation area. So, you can see, even with all that, there's still, I think, room for improvement. Now, that's not going to happen at the trigger reactor because it's easier just to restrict access to it, to the top of the reactor, and and maintain our operational flexibility. So the hurdle that you run into with how small can you make it isn't driven by the nuclear side of things. It really is driven by shielding and balance of plant. And what I mean by balance of plant is, how do you take the thermal energy that's coming out of your nuclear reactor and turn it into usable electricity? And that's not an insignificant challenge.
In terms of shielding, too, you said you use concrete and water.
Yes.
Are there better materials for that are they're probably more expensive, and depending on who you are, it might not be worth doing? We hear about lead or whatever. I don't know.
So I don't want to paint a negative picture for the material science streamers, because really material science is what's going to allow us to really increase the rate of expansion of nuclear energy. But are there better materials? It really depends on what you're trying to shield, because you use water or some other hydrogenous material to shield neutrons. You have to use something really dense to shield gamma, and of course if you're spitting out betas or free electrons, you have to then use something light behind something that is heavy to protect against Bremsstrahlung or a particular secondary radiation. So you have to have a composite system.
There's a whole spectrum of things that require different types of materials.
And this is also why safety analysts, with respect to shielding analysts, they get paid big bucks specifically because they have to consider not only the spectra of materials that will effectively stop the spectra of radiation that's coming out, but then they have to optimize it for whatever operational purpose it is. If that's your stationary reactor, that's one thing. But if it's a small modular that's below grade, that's a different thing. Because again, the question is, who are you trying to protect? And that's an important question to consider whenever you talk about shielding.
Yeah, I bring up the topic because part of my futurism shtick is the far future, when we're colonizing planets and going out into the galaxy or something like that. I can't imagine any source of power other than nuclear being small enough to something that provides enough power to run a generation ship or a colony ship with 10,000 people on it. At a certain distance, solar's not going to work. You're just too far away from any solar source, and what else is there going to be out there?
Right, yeah, and the energy density for any sort of chemical burners is just not... It's too low, and you have to take too much of it along. So the energy density to mass ratio is just... it indicates that nuclear is the only option. Yeah, and that's actually so you're not alone in thinking that. There was a generation of technical innovators that looked to nuclear to not only get us into space, but to also provide a home for us, or to somehow, terraform space, or to make it a little less hostile. Unfortunately, as we've seen, the trend towards government funding of these dream the impossible dream projects and looking to space, it just dries up. Yeah. And I don't think we're going to see that ever again, or at least not until some pretty significant budget reform happens. So let's just assume never.
So perhaps crawling farther down the science fiction rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Fusion.
Oh, fusion.
I am still under the impression that cold fusion is never going to happen. But I don't know what the definition of cold fusion is these days, but I know I just read about a German reactor that at least ran for a little while.
Really?
Doing fusion, like a few seconds, but they managed to produce plasma from the fusion for a few seconds. So it sounds like something that is a long, long way down the road if we ever get there. Do you know of anyone? Is it still being seriously researched, or is it sort of at a point where it's like so technologically challenging that it's not? It'll sort of tiptoe along until some breakthrough happens.
Yes, okay. There is a subsection of our population. When I say our population, I mean the nuclear field that is intensely interested in fusion. The answer to the question whether or not we'll see it is dependent on several things. And this is where I'm a little skeptical of fusion for a couple of reasons. And I want to go into them, so let's go. Yeah. Let's do it. There are two types of fusion. There is something called inertial confinement fusion. And then there's I forget what the technical term is, but basically it's your magnetically confined fusion. This is your tokamak. The
German one was, yeah.
So tokamaks and inertial confinement fusion, they work. They work great. The problem comes from, especially when you come to your magnetic confinement fusion, is that you have to keep your plasma so tightly contained, and it's very hard to do that when it's spitting out a lot of heavy charged particles, because materials degradation happens at a very accelerated rate. And that's just the material science side of things. My own skepticism comes from the fact that there's a very simple question that I got asked, and I still don't have an answer for it. How do you make steam with the sun? I assume there's a strategy. There have to be. And if I can't think of them, I'm sure someone smarter than me will come along and do it. But I still don't have an answer for that, and that's going to be one of those you got to answer.
I would assume that this makes an enormous amount of heat.
An incredible amount of heat.
But then that's a whole factor of complexity to have the thing that contains the plasma and then to collect that heat, and that sort of exponentially increases the difficulty of the problem, doesn't it?
It does. And then when you consider that fusion is spitting out these very damaging heavy charged particles, you're seeing alphas and some other more exotic particles that you don't see outside of space, that you have to deal with, because they are going to wreak havoc on your electrical systems. And that's really where I think the next challenge lies.
There's I guess I've had the perception too that fusion, I guess nobody really understands. In layman's terms, we don't understand how it works. I was under sort of the impression that it was not as dangerous as fission, or did not produce the waste, but obviously, I guess if I think about it a little further, if I have a little mini sun, there's a lot of stuff streaming out of the sun that wants to kill me. So
the sun is not your friend.
It's certainly fusion is certainly not a friendly, happy kind of process either.
That's correct. It doesn't have the same magnitude of waste because it doesn't come in the same type. And that is to say, it's not the same elemental form. Now, if you have solid waste, and you maybe have some condensable and some non-condensable gases, trapped in the matrix of your fuel, but largely it's solid waste. Fusion does not generate solid waste, but it does generate a number of radiological hazards in the form of heavy charged particles, neutrons, betas, your regular spectra of your usual suspects.
Yeah.
But they're at high energies, and they're not moderated the same way that they would be in a nuclear reactor in fission, just because you can't maintain your magnetic field when you've got a bunch of concrete, steel, water, what have you in the way.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be one of those material science challenges that I think defines a generation. Is it our generation? I think everyone wants to believe so, and I really want to encourage the researchers who are currently involved in this. So I'm going to say yes. I think it's our generation, but I don't think it's something worth pinning your hopes on. I think that's one of those technologies that, like storage, it's great to work towards, and we should continue to fund it.
Yeah.
But we should not put the fate of our planet in its hands.
It sounds like something that, at least at this point, I'm forgetting the two researchers who claimed to have done it years ago.
Oh, cold fusion.
Yeah. It's at least moved out of the realm of fiction and made up, their research was not right, to, we can actually do it. It's more a proof of concept stage in a way.
Yes.
There's certainly nothing practical that we can do with it now.
Well, so that actually that heavily depends on the kind of fusion you're talking about. So let me break down. So I mentioned inertial confinement fusion. So I'll introduce what that actually is. It's when you take this deuterium-tritium target. And it's very, very small. It's on the order of microns to millimeters, depending on where you are. And you center it in this target, and then you target all these lasers around it. And that's how you provide the thermal energy necessary to achieve that plasma and that fusion. Okay. Now, you might notice that it's a very small target, and it's a very short-lived process. So how you take that and then repeat it to such a level that you're getting energy out of with that level of precision is, again, one of those challenges that I just don't... I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but it seems daunting.
Yeah.
For magnetic confinement fusion, it actually is at a point where it's at an energy break-even point. Like, you're getting the same amount of energy out as you're putting in, if you believe some of the publications that I've seen. But you're right, like, you're still not at the stage where we figured out how to turn a turbine with it.
Yeah. So, I'm putting all my money on Dyson Sphere.
All right.
I don't know. I don't have any more questions about nuclear power. Is there anything else you would like to add or to summarize for our audience?
Ooh, man, we did sort of cover a lot of things, so I think a pithy summary might be a little bit beyond me. But I do want to end with the following consideration. We are not alone in the nuclear world in the United States. And it's important to keep that in mind. We pioneered this technology, but it is no longer our own. Light water reactors exist all over the world, and a lot of countries are developing them. That's great. But it does mean the advantages that we've enjoyed, abundant, cheap, steady-priced uranium, is about to go away. China has canceled, I forget what the exact number is, but a lot of their coal-fired plants, and instead are investing heavily in the AP1000 or in the Chinese equivalent. And according to some of the projections I've seen, if that growth rate continues, they will consume almost 50% of the world's uranium. That's not something to take lightly. Additionally, the UK has released their carbon plan, where they're going to decarbonize their energy grid 80% by 2050, I think. And that's a legally binding document, so it's reasonable to assume that they're going to start investing in nuclear as well. So again, they're also going to be one of the biggest consumers of nuclear material. I think if we want to maintain the pride of ownership, if we want to continue to support this technology that we as a country helped pioneer, we're going to have to ask ourselves some very hard questions. Specifically, do we want to pin our hopes on future technology saving us? Do we want to accept that we can implement renewables, but without a back end that's carbon neutral, without a base load carbon neutral source, we're just increasing pollution? Are we willing to accept that? And are we willing to accept the continued operation of industries like natural gas operating without the same level of oversight? Are we comfortable letting markets continue to operate in this fractured regional system where the game is rigged? Those are questions that don't have easy answers, but I don't think they're impossible questions. I think it's just going to take a lot of patience on the part of the technically engaged community to communicate and really engage the fears and concerns that people have. Because whether or not we want to admit it, their fears are real. Even if they're technically unfounded, and we know better, and we can beat them over the head with facts all day long. The fear is still real. And until we can address that, and then together provide answers to those questions, nuclear just doesn't have the bright future that was promised. And I think a nuclear panacea where we can have that non-carbon emitting, cheap electricity, I think that's a promise worth pursuing. And I think it's worth putting aside some of the partisan differences that we've very clearly seen and working towards together. I think that's a worthwhile goal.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you, Josh, for being here. And everybody go give nuclear a hug.
Hug your nuclear engineer. Ask them first. They might get squirrely.
All right, that's your show. Thanks for joining me for this long discussion about nuclear energy and how it really works and what the current technology and near future technology might be. I certainly considered the possibility that this particular topic would be something of a hot button issue, so if you would like to send me angry email, you may do so at Sean, that's S-E-A-N, at panfuture.org. Come visit the website panfuture.org and find links to Facebook and Twitter and all that good stuff. At this point, I'm not sure how many shows this series will run, but I will continue the energy discussion so long as I keep finding topics to cover. If you have some suggestions or questions or anything, please send them along as well. And I will talk to you again in the future.